Chappelle. All right, welcome back to Mr. Wooderson's room. Ew. Look, I had to find somewhere downstairs that I could quickly record because I had a couple meetings yesterday that popped up, didn't realize, so it was going to take me a second to kind of record this. So I had to come in super early. The sun's not even up yet. It's ridiculous. It's like 6:40. Look at that. It's dark outside still. That's weird. Now, anyway, so where we left off in class, we were talking about the scientific revolution, right? And so where we kind of began with the scientific revolution is we were discussing a lot of stuff about what heliocentric means, what geocentric means. We were talking about what these experts thought about all this different stuff, and these experts were mostly church officials, and how some of the earliest ideas about the universe come mainly from philosophers like Aristotle and Ptolemy, right? And those guys who only had the use of their eyes and no proper instruments actually really thought that the world was geocentric, and we don't blame them for thinking that because it does kind of seem like the world's stationary because we're so tiny, teeny tiny and infinitesimal, right? So now the big thing though is then we talked about a Polish scientist named Nicholas Copernicus, all right? He is so important. You need to make sure that you have Nicholas Copernicus highlighted, underlined, starred, make it look like it's exploding or something like that. But he is going to be the very first person to come along and actually say that the heliocentric model is where it's at. I don't know why Mr. Wooderson has this random stick. All right, so now anyway, it's probably for beating kids. Now, anyway, so the big thing about it, though, is that he is going to be the big thing, the person to come along, and he's going to suggest that in his book known as De Rev, right? So De Rev is actually a tome that was very, very long, and of course the title is De Revolutionis or so, and he is going to be the very first person to suggest that heliocentric model. And then he's going to die 2 weeks later after it's published, mainly because he wanted to avoid persecution by these experts, right? So the big thing about understanding who these experts are, and so many of you got it yesterday. I know Krista got it. I know that Sophia Piccola got it. I know several people in class got it yesterday, and a lot of other kids were just really killing it. Emily Manning crushing it yesterday, really understands what's going on. So the big thing about it though is that he wanted to avoid the church, right? He wants to avoid being persecuted and stuff like that. That's why he kind of waited until he was about to die to issue his book. Now, these experts that would have actually probably brought him in front of an inquisition used one motion that I went on a tirade about yesterday as proof that we are actually the center and all the planets go around us. And they called it retrograde motion, right? And retrograde motion is that goofy thing that people talk about all the time, which is going on right now apparently, where it's Mercury is in retrograde. Mercury retrograde, and it affects your feelings and all this other stuff, and how to survive Mercury retrograde. It means nothing, all right? So, it means absolutely nothing. It's absolutely ridiculous because all it is an optical illusion, right? So it is an optical illusion that makes it appear as though a planet is moving backwards when it actually isn't. It just has to do with the fact that where the sun is positioned in our orbit and where the other planets are positioned in their orbits around us because they move either faster or slower depending on where they are. Now, anyway, so the big thing about it, though, is that retrograde motion becomes kind of a thorn in a lot of people's sides, right? So people that want to actually propose this heliocentric model, these scientists that come along a little bit later, they know that they're right, but they can't figure out a way to prove or disprove heliocentrism because of this nuisance known as retrograde motion. Now, when we go forward, though, after Copernicus is already dead, and poor Pluto, I forgot I had that in here. Look at little Pluto getting kicked out of the club. Now, look, so the big thing about it, though, is that Nicholas Copernicus is the very first scientist of a then tidal wave of other scientists that are going to show up. So the next guy that pops up is this dude named Tycho Brahe, right? And he looks like this. He looks kind of like a walrus to me. He looks a little ridiculous, and apparently he was a little ridiculous. He's a very weird guy. He's a Danish scientist that the king of Denmark was like, please don't leave. Please don't take your intelligence to other countries. We love you. I'll give you an island. And literally, Tycho Brahe lived on an island where he had 2 different telescopes that he would use and 2 different observational areas that he would use all the time. Apparently, he really liked to party, and he really liked to get into fights with people about math problems, right? Because apparently what happened is he got into an argument with one of his cousins over a math problem, and they had a duel with each other, and what ended up happening is that Tycho Brahe's nose got sliced off, right? And that literally right there, that's his prosthetic nose that he stuck on the tip of his nose whenever he would have parties and stuff like that. Sometimes he would actually use a wax one that looked kind of like skin, and other times he would use a very ostentatious gold one because he was like, oh, look at me. Now, he also had a pet moose that died at a party because he got too drunk and fell down a flight of stairs, but Tycho Brahe is a very weird guy. But the big thing about Tycho Brahe is the fact that he was methodical. Now, Now, what I mean by being methodical is he legit was like so into studying the night sky and looking at every single star, where it was, and finding out all of its locations and its movements, right? So he spent years analyzing the stars, trying to come up with a conclusion that would set up the universe. Now, his idea for the universe was kind of dumb. It literally had like the Earth, and then the sun was going around it, but then all the other planets were going around the sun. So his model of the universe was not good, right? But what is it about science that's so important? It's data, right? Data. Have to have data to actually look at things, right? Talk to Miss Sharon, talk to Miss Merrill. You got to understand, without data, we can prove nothing, right? So he is the guy that kind of accrues all the data that scientists are going to be able to use a little bit later to figure out all this stuff and how these planets are set up, right? And he actually collected all this data in his thing known as the Rudolphine tables, right? Now, he did this after he left Denmark and was actually living in the Holy Roman Empire, because that entire Rudolphine tables thing was named for this guy named King Rudolph, right, of the Holy Roman Empire. So the thing about it, though, is in that book, he tracked the location and movement of 777 different stars, planets, and celestial objects. That is a lot of data to actually use right there. Also, another big thing, though, as well, is that when you look at Aristotle and Ptolemy and their ideas about the universe, they believe that heaven kind of existed right outside of Earth, and that all the stars and that all the planets were these perfect little things created by some other kind of being and stuff like that, and that they never muted and they never changed and they were beautiful and awesome and they were just like, meh. Now, the thing about it, though, is that he is going to realize that no, they are actually not perfect, that things are exploding and moving and dying and being born all the time. And he noticed this one time when he observed a star going to supernova, right? He actually saw a star being born, right? So stars begin as supernovas and end as supernovas when the gas inside of them either is about to be compacted or is about to expel, right? So the thing about it is he observed a star being born in the constellation of Cassiopeia, and he wrote a pamphlet about it. He's like, dude, stars are born, stars die, things blow up, things collide, there are comets and crazy other creepy things out there. It is not the heavens, it's a whole other plane, right? So he did not have a good universe model, but his information was really good stuff. Now, going into it, though, then he had an assistant. So when he moved to the Holy Roman Empire and he actually wrote the Rudolphine tables and he actually did all this stuff, he had a young assistant that was German, and his name was Johannes Kepler, right? So Johannes Kepler is the assistant to Tycho Brahe, which, why did I spell Brahe with a Y? Now, he's going to be a big wig in this entire thing, because he comes along and he proves, holy crap, it is heliocentric, right? The thing he does is he comes along and he is a Copernican himself and he believes in heliocentrism, but he's like, but how do we get rid of this pesky retrograde motion? He's the one that comes along and uses the data collected in the Rudolphine tables by Brahe and synthesizes it with a new model of the universe. He takes the orbits of the planets, and instead of being circles, he makes them ovals. And by making them ovals, it proves that planets move at different speeds as they get closer to the sun, which would actually help us understand why we view planets going backwards when they actually never do. So Johannes Kepler, oval orbits, very important. Next to Johannes Kepler's name, just draw an oval for me really quick. An oval orbit, right? Or ellipticals, okay? So he's going to do that in about 1609. He's a very, very major figure in the understanding of the scientific revolution, but probably no other figure is bigger wig and bigger known than this guy right here. That dude is Galileo Galilei, right? So now, Galileo Galilei is probably the most important scientific thinker of this entire flip, of this entire unit, of this entire section. He is so freaking important, right? Because he is an Italian scientist that comes along, and even after Kepler came up with his elliptical orbits, and Tycho Brahe got his nose cut off and had all this data and stuff like that, even after all of that, people still didn't believe it. They were still like, no. The church says that, and also I'm not ragging on the church. The church, honestly had a lot of other political things going on. They were at a war at the time, the Reformation's going on. I don't blame them for, sticking to their guns, but at the same time, it's just ah. Now, anyway, so the big thing that ends up happening, though, is this Italian scientist named Galileo comes along, and he is, still arguing with all these other, experts and stuff that are still saying geocentrism exists. And he's like, no, it doesn't. I'm going to prove heliocentrism. And he does it using this device that he had learned how to make really well while he was a ballistics what's it call it? Why he worked for the artillery of Venice, okay? Like as a ballistics expert. There you go. Because Galileo realizes how to take a telescope and make it even better, right? So the very first telescope was not invented by Galileo. It was actually invented by this guy named Anton von blah, 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 from from the Netherlands, right? So the big thing about it though is he did not invent the telescope, but he did actually figure out how to make his telescopes better by adding new lenses to them and concave and convex so you could refract the light back and forth. So the thing about it is his telescope designs make it so he can actually analyze certain things in the night sky. And he actually only made these telescopes to actually give away to his patrons and people that gave him money for a while. Now, also, his telescopes were mainly used for spotting ships out in harbors, but then he was just like, how would I look at stars and stuff with it? So he starts analyzing the night sky with the telescopes that he's developed. Now, with this, he sees and observes comets, the moons of Jupiter and other moving bodies, right? And he realizes that the moon goes around us and it is a very small object. The moons of Jupiter go around it and they are much smaller than Jupiter. So he realizes that there's a relation between the size of a body, and he uses mathematics to prove that smaller objects go around larger ones. And if that is the case, the sun is well beyond the size of Earth and any other planet. I don't think you understand how big the sun is, okay? It is ridiculous because this is like, you could take Earth, right? Take Earth and put it inside the sun 1.3 million times. The sun is 1.3 million times the size of Earth, and he uses his telescope to start figuring all of this out. He also uses it to prove the fact when he actually does these drawings of the moon that the surface of the moon is not perfect, that things have crashed into it. It's cratered and dimpled and has all these little errors all over it and stuff. And so the thing about it is he releases a lot of these early findings, and he also does a lot of this in a pamphlet that he issues called The Assayer. And The Assayer is about a comet that's coming by. Now here's the funniest part about this entire story. Guess who one of his best friends was that he dedicates The Assayer to? None other than Pope Urban VIII. That's right, the guy that is going to be accused by the church of heresy, the guy that is going to be accused by the church of being wicked, is going to actually be really, really close friends with the Pope at the time. Now, they were actually super close, and he dedicated this pamphlet about this comet to him and stuff like that. And that begins a dialogue, right? And he starts talking to the Pope. He says, Urban, bro, I don't know if you know this or not, but we go around the sun. And Urban leans into Galileo, and he's like, dude, they've been saying that since that Copernicus guy. And we've been pretty sure that we go around the sun for a long time now. Problem is that we're in the middle of a war. We're in the middle of this thing called the 30 Years' War, which is literally one of the most devastating events that's ever hit Europe ever. So the thing about it going forward, Urban says, we understand that you have these ideas. And if you want to write a book about it, you can. But you have to actually provide the images of both sides, right? He says, okay, you can write your book, okay, but you have to support both sides. You can bring up your end, but you must bring up the church's end as well of geocentrism. And he says, okay, and so he writes a book called The Dialogue on the Two Chief World Systems in 1632. Now, the thing about it is it's about 10 or 13 years before he dies, and so he's a little bit of an older guy at the time, and at this point, how many of y'all have ever met your grandpa and stuff like that, and he's a little bit older and he just doesn't care anymore? So, that's kind of what Galileo's at right now. Galileo writes this book, and in this book, he sets it up so it's one impartial person. There are three characters in his book. One guy is a guy that doesn't know anything about the universe at all. The other two guys are guys that are trying to convince that man which model is right. The heliocentric one or the geocentric one. So the heliocentric character is intelligent and learned and scientific and suave and clever and stuff like that. And starts bringing up all these really, really awesome points and all these other things. And then the other one is the Catholic Church guy who supports geocentrism, and his name is Simplicio, which in Latin means idiot. All right, so he actually uses his book to make fun of the church and their perspective, and this lands him in a lot of hot water because he is brought in front of an Inquisition trial, and he is tried for heresy because his buddy Pope Urban's like, bro, did you have to go and do that? I told you could do it. You just had to be chill. And Galileo, of course, has no chill whatsoever. So the thing about it is he is tried in front of this Inquisition for heresy, and he is going to be forced to recant his ideas. Galileo Galilei the guy that literally Galileo is like literally modeled after, you have to understand, literally had to take back all of his ideas and the things he said. He was forced to recant, and he spent the rest of his life under house arrest. Now, while he was under house arrest, he figured out a lot of other stuff, though. It was a really good time to do some work, apparently. He figured out that all bodies moving back to Earth move in a parabola shape. Like if I throw my football in class, it's going to kind of come down in an arc due to the gravity and the actual declination of the Earth. He figured out basically mathematically how to make satellites. And then he also figured out that all bodies, when dropped from the same height, as long as they don't catch air, will hit the ground at the exact same time. And when he wrote that part of his book, he actually, and that was on the New Sciences, when he wrote that part of his book, he actually used in a story that he was on top of the Leaning Tower of Pisa and was dropping like a cannonball and a penny or something like that. He didn't actually do that because he was under house arrest, but he did figure out that all bodies coming back to the Earth will actually hit at the exact same time. And fun fact, his middle finger is in a glass jar in Florence, Italy, right? Like, look at that bad boy. His middle finger is in a glass jar because a guy that was dug up his body and stole it, and that is Galileo's decaying middle finger forever, ever in history, flipping off the world, being like, I told you I was right. Now, so anyway, so going forward, you have to also understand we have a couple of other scientists that we got to bring up a little bit, and they mostly analyze this new kind of idea of this new scientific method, right? So this new scientific method is this idea that's coming around that goes hand in hand with Galileo stuff. And it had been happening in the background, during all this crazy, space stuff, heliocentrism, geocentrism this entire time. But it was mainly just a series of steps, right? An analysis way to solve a scientific question. Now, the thing about it is, we've known, or you know, the scientific method. You do it in science class all the time. Science and scientific method is based off observation and experimentation rather than church law and assumption, right? So, the big thing about science is coming up with a hypothesis, creating an experiment around that hypothesis, analyzing your results, and then coming up with a conclusion, right? Y'all do this in labs all the time. You do this in science all the time. Every time I see y'all with your safety goggles on, y'all are just getting after it, right? So now, the thing about it, though, is that entire idea wasn't technically invented by this guy named Francis Bacon, but the guy named Francis Bacon is going to be the very first person to kind of write it down, right? So Francis Bacon actually wrote a couple of different books, one of his most popular ones being called New Atlantis, right? And the New Sciences. So he actually wrote this book saying that, we must use the ideas of observation, experimentation, hypotheses to solve as many problems as we possibly can. We will use this, and then we'll use it to the betterment of mankind, right? And so, Francis Bacon, who knew Elizabeth I, Henry VIII's daughter, and stuff like that, and was a member of Parliament and an Englishman himself, is credited a lot of times with inventing the scientific method because of this. Just remember, Francis Bacon, scientific method, all right? So then you've got another guy named René Descartes, who comes along and says, but how do we know anything for sure? And he starts kind of really questioning the orientation of existence and information and understanding and reasoning. He's like, is it possible that the human mind can achieve so much? And so he adds a whole other perspective on the sciences. And he is very famous for creating a lot of new types of math, having the worst haircut on the planet, and writing different philosophies. But the entire idea of his principles, known as Cartesian dualism, is he believes that the human mind and the human body exist almost in different planes. Because the human mind can take in information, solve it, process it, and figure other new ideas out, right? And so he comes up with a very famous quote, known as I think, therefore I am. And what I want you to do is highlight that, and we will talk about that in class because I don't have enough time to really truly explain it right now, and I don't want to rush it. But another big thing that apparently Descartes came up with, which is something I'll probably ask you in your warm-up tomorrow to make sure that you watch this all the way to the end and make sure that you actually were paying attention, is he also came up with those things that y'all use in math. The y and x-axis, graphs, they're called Cartesian planes. Because he was laying awake in his bed at night, he was looking up at his roof, and a fly apparently kept flying around all over his roof and kept going zzz, zzz, and he kept looking up there, and he's like, if I put lines up there in a grid, I could chart where that fly moved all over my entire roof. And apparently that was the origin of the Cartesian plane. So the big thing about it, though, is we'll pick up on Descartes tomorrow. I'll see y'all then. Y'all have a good one.